I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Albert Einstein. In 1944, the United States changed the world forevermore as through the Manhattan Project, they unleashed a new weapon to the world. The US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Germany, ending World War II. The use of nuclear weapons forced the Axis powers to surrender. Yet, unbeknownst to the US, they had unwittingly let the genie out of the bottle, and once he's out, he won't go back in. The USSR was the first to gain nuclear armaments in just 4 years. Then, they ensured there would not be another invasion of the motherland. Refusing to release the lands freed from Axis control, the USSR enacted the Warsaw Pact. They propped up communist governments and satellite states in East Germany, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. With these buffer states set and the Warsaw Pact sealed, thus began the Cold War. As time passed, both sides began stockpiling substantial nuclear arsenals for deterrence. Additionally, during this arms buildup, other countries began their own nuclear research. The United Kingdom in 1952, France in 1960, and China in 1964 all developed nuclear weapons. However, as more nations became nuclear, the first lunar war against the Beta was already underway. Then in 1973, after a series of defeats, the Beta invaded Earth, landing in Kashgar in the People's Republic of China. Eager to monopolize research on the Beta, the Chinese government declined the help offered by the international community. Soon after landing, countless Beta emerged from their craft, starting their invasion. With the use of air power, the Beta were quickly put in check by the Chinese Republic Army. The success of the Chinese created a mentality adopted by the people of Earth. If it's on Earth, we can win. During the first 2 weeks of the invasion, this proved true. Unfortunately, the sentiment would not last. After just 2 weeks, a new Beta, previously unencountered on the moon, shut down access to air power. The Laser class emerged from their craft and raked the skies with laser irradiation, shooting down aircraft, missiles, and even mid-flight artillery shells. With the Laser class, so went the use of air power. These developments quickly forced the Chinese government to organize a new offensive. Now working with the Soviets, they organized a new defense against the encroaching Beta horde. This new defense comprised several armored corps, but compared to the overwhelming numbers of the Beta that stretched across the horizon, the Sino-Soviet forces were in an uphill battle from the start. Without ready access to supplies via air, the combined defense line was annihilated. The Chinese and Soviets, with no other alternative left, made the only choice available. A scorched earth tactic was employed. Russo-Chinese forces deployed every available nuclear weapon against the advancing Beta. The deployment of nuclear weapons was not enough. Time and time again, despite successful nuclear strikes against the Beta, they simply replenished their numbers and marched again. To compound matters, the Beta had entrenched themselves at their landing point, building a colossal structure. They created the first hive, and humanity would call it Hive 01, or simply the first objective. Any strike, nuclear or otherwise, against the Hive was ineffective due to the heavy presence of Laser class. It would also not be long before the Beta would develop another strain, the Heavy Laser class. With an all-around range of 100 kilometers, the airspace around the Hive would be utterly cut off. With their Hive secured, the Beta began their all-out assault on humanity, spreading across the Eurasian continent. While the situation in Europe started growing increasingly grim, the Beta launched a second landing craft from the moon. On June 6, 1974, a second landing craft landed in Canada, Saskatchewan, Athabasca. With the horrors from the European front fresh in their minds, the US and Canadian governments agreed on swift action against the Beta. The US would carry out several nuclear strikes against Athabasca. While the exact number of nuclear strikes is unknown, they were deployed enough to annihilate all Beta off Athabasca. This would be a Pyrrhic victory, with the strikes rendering half of Canada into an uninhabitable nuclear wasteland for decades to come. The destruction of the Athabasca Beta marked humanity's first significant victory. The success of such a strategy allowed Western NATO forces to use Athabasca as a point of reference for the use of strategic weapons against the Beta. This would come ahead in 1976 when the Beta would establish the Minsk Hive in Belarusia, dubbed Hive 05. This exposed the greater of Europe to direct Beta assault. However, while it was under construction, the WTO approached NATO forces for a joint offensive against Hive 05. During the planning phase of what would later be named Operation Paleologos, NATO would suggest the use of nuclear strikes on the Hive, but WTO forces would countermand this proposition, citing that nuclear strikes are a suicidal tactic. The use of strategic weapons against overwhelming Beta numbers was simply not a viable option. Their use rendered territories uninhabitable, as much as half of Canada was irradiated. Additionally, WTO forces wanted to capture the Beta-made G element, which at the time was theorized to be right underneath the monument. Ultimately, the WTO's reasoning against nuclear strikes won out, setting the stage for Operation Paleologos. The primary objective of Operation Paleologos was twofold. First, secure the Eurozone and check the Beta's advance westward. Second, the first Beta Hive capture. Such a victory would potentially turn the tide of the war and give humanity the initiative it required to bolster the front lines for further counterattacks. On the 1st of September 1978, coalition forces initiated the first infiltration of a Beta Hive. Tragically, the infiltration units, consisting of armored regiments from NATO, EU, WTO, and the Soviet 43rd Tactical Armored Division, were lost in just 3.5 hours into the operation. Military intelligence had underestimated the length of the stab, and the infiltration force was not prepared for the overwhelming number of Beta inside the many drifts of the Hive. Operation Paleologos was an unmitigated disaster. Coalition forces suffered 80% losses to a Beta counterattack that threatened to encircle the besieging forces at the Minsk Hive. With no other choice, all sides withdrew, and the Beta began a renewed counteroffensive that would signal a gradual retreat from Europe, a decade in the making. Following the continued loss of ground, the US came to hold the firm belief that this war would not be won through conventional methods. Finally, in the intermittent years of the loss of Europe, they would develop a strategic weapon that would deprive the Beta of its laser class advantage. This weapon would wipe off a Hive from the face of the earth. Before this weapon would see the light of day, the Beta would drive humanity completely off the Eurasian continent. By this point, the nations of the world had resigned themselves to the limited use of nuclear weapons on Earth. A few notable examples are the Kra Canal connecting the Gulf of Thailand with the Andaman Sea. Pressed for time, the canal was excavated using nuclear weapons, while in North America, the US had the Redshift contingency plan. Redshift comprised over 200 hydrogen bombs placed underground in Alaska. In the event that Alaska was to be lost, and a large number of Beta crossed the red line, the hydrogen bombs beneath the red line would automatically be set off, creating an artificial strait. The strait would become the new eastern defense line against the Beta's onslaught. Though the use of nuclear weapons on Earth had been limited, space was another matter entirely. After the Kashgar and Athabasca landing units, the UN formally devised a plan to prevent further Beta craft from making landfall. Though formally led by the UN, this project had the lion's share of the work done by the US Space Command. Data from the 2 initial beta incursions pointed to the moon's orbit as the best place to intercept. So, U.S. Space Command would build the Artemis Defense System. The defense system consisted of 3 phases. Phase 1 was surveillance satellites placed around the moon's orbit. Phase 2 was an early detection surveillance station at Lagrange 2. And Phase 3 was the Space 1 station at Lagrange 1 that intercepts the landing craft with nuclear missiles. Artemis comprised the overall Shadow defense system, keeping Earth safe from further landings. It is the first and last line of defense, keeping an already beleaguered humanity from being overrun from space as well as land. Despite being relegated to only their ground forces, the Beta still posed a catastrophic threat to humanity. With Eurasia firmly in their control, the Beta began an invasion of Japan on the 7th of July 1998. The Beta would cross the Sea of Japan and emerge on the island of Tsushima. As the vanguard of the Beta emerged on the island, the large-scale environmental destruction by the Beta ravaging the Eurasian continent caused a super-large typhoon. The typhoon affected the areas of Okinawa and Kyushu, hindering evacuation efforts. It also delayed the deployment of the Japanese Navy. Along with being caught off guard by the sudden invasion, Imperial military intelligence had predicted an invasion as late as 1999, given how recent the Sherwan hive still was. Without the initial support from the Navy, the Beta made landfall on the Japanese mainland in Nagasaki, Kumamoto, and Yamaguchi. Compiling their troubles, the ongoing typhoon didn't allow evacuation ships to berth, and the land evacuation of civilians was far too slow. At this time, fighting with the Japanese Imperial Armed Forces were the U.S. forces stationed in Japan, per the Japanese-U.S. Security Treaty formed in 1944. During this initial stage of the invasion, U.S. command suggested the use of nuclear weapons in the aforementioned regions. Barring that, they also wished to deploy the new weapon they had developed to finally check the Beta's advance. Imperial Military Command rejected the proposal wholeheartedly, citing not only civilian casualties would be tremendous, but also how ineffective their use was for the Sino-Soviet forces. U.S. Command accepted the decision, but they would not be rebuffed like they were in Operation Paleologos forever. By the 12th of July, the Beta had the Imperial Army on the back foot, reaching the first Imperial capital defense line at Himeji. With the Imperial capital Kyoto being directly threatened, the IJA sent reinforcements to the capital defense line. Despite their best efforts, the defense line collapsed in only half a day. By the 13th of July, the Beta reached Kobe, putting the Beta within striking distance of the Imperial capital. The IJA reformed their defense line outside the capital, but U.S. command instead suggested they abandon Kyoto and form a new defense line around the Lake Biwa Canal. By this time, government functions were already in the process of relocating to Tokyo. Despite this, the Japanese refused to abandon Kyoto as it held a meaning more profound than just the capital city of Japan. So U.S. command was rebuffed once more, and the IJA dug in to protect the capital. The defense of the capital was primarily comprised of the Imperial 1st Capital Defense Division and 2nd Royal Guard Regiment. Thanks to naval and orbital assets, the IJA was able to hold firm despite the Beta having reached Osaka. This initial push, however, did not last, and by the end of July, the Kyoto Defense Forces were utterly wiped out. By the 10th of August, after continued losses, the Tokyo-established government formally gave up Kyoto and had U.S. and Imperial forces retreat from the capital. By the 15th of August, the 2nd Royal Guard Regiment was last to leave Kyoto, as the 1,200-year-old capital burned to the Beta's merciless advance. The following months were one disastrous retreat after the other. The Beta pushed deeper and deeper into the mainland. Finally, they erected a hive on both Satogoshima and Yokohama, Hive 21 and Hive 22 respectively, in December of 1998. Under the suggestion of Professor Kazuki Yuko, of the UN 11th Forces, the UN proposed a joint operation to take the Hive 22. After months of planning, Operation Lucifer began on the 5th of August 1999. UN orbital divers infiltrated Hive 22, while the UN and Imperial Navy conducted a saturation assault alongside ground forces on the Beta guarding the Hive. Upon infiltrating the Stab, the initial prediction of its network had been mistaken, putting the Hive farther along than its monument suggested. This posed the IJA and UN with a choice: continue the operation at significant risk to the divers, or pull back and begin the operation again after reforming. Ultimately, neither the IJA nor the UN command were given a choice. US Space Command issued an immediate retreat order to all forces assaulting the Hive 22. The US's 5th Orbital Fleet dropped 2 experimental 5th dimensional effect bombs from geostationary orbit at 8:16 on the 6th of August 1999. These experimental weapons were created by gathering G element, an utterly alien new substance made by the Beta. The US was able to recover a substantial amount to stockpile these weapons. When deployed, the G bombs create a gravitational field that deflects lasers and tears apart anything caught within its envelope. The experimental weapons, unofficially dubbed G bombs, detonated over Hive 22, creating a 5th dimensional effect explosion through extreme gravitational distortions. The Hive monument was entirely destroyed, and all Beta ground forces were annihilated. The UN and IJA forces mopped up any remaining Beta that escaped the blast radius. After the explosion, the UN sent forces to capture the Hive and its reactor, securing the G elements inside. For the first time since the start of the war, humanity had finally captured a Beta Hive. However, it was at the cost of many men and women who were not able to evacuate the area on time. The region around Yokohama was rendered barren and utterly lifeless. Unlike radiation, humans seemed capable of existing within the blast zone. However, long-term exposure to the after effects of a G-bomb is still being studied. The UN 11th Forces raised a base over the remains of the Hive. The personnel stationed there also became a part of a study into prolonged exposure to the G-bomb's aftermath. The experiment was headed by Professor Kazuki Yuko, a prominent figure who discourages the use of G-bombs. It is rumored she wrote a thesis on what the use of multiple G-bombs would do to Earth. While never made public, rumors suggest nothing short of an apocalyptic event would follow the advent of a saturated G-bomb attack against the Beta. Ultimately, the use of strategic weapons against the Beta comes down to a cost-benefit value. While Athabasca and Operation Lucifer have shown strategic weapons can work, it has done so to the cost of the planet as a whole. Over half of the Canadian wilderness will remain a nuclear wasteland for decades to come. Yokohama has been rendered a barren wasteland devoid of life and incapable of producing greenery for an unknown or permanent period of time. Perhaps worse still is the rumored apocalyptic event that a mass detonation of 5th dimensional expansion bombs could cause. To the nations who wish one day to reclaim their lost homelands, the use of strategic weapons is nothing short of a mutually assured destruction. The inception of the G-bomb finally handed humanity a weapon that could destroy Beta Hives, yet its use still brings with it many unknowns. The US itself uses Operation Lucifer as a proof of concept that G-bombs not only work, but are mankind's one and only hope. However, within the UN, an alternative to the G-bomb exists, a weapon initially scrapped by the US, also utilizing G elements. This weapon, perfected by the genius Professor Kazuki Yuko, promises the light of dawn is not yet beyond humanity's reach.
Ciao!